Hi everyone, I'm Arina Grossu and I'm here with Roger Severino, Director of the Office for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And we will be discussing what HHS and the Trump administration have done in the fight for human dignity. Roger, can you tell me a little bit more about what this administration has done to protect religious freedom?
Well, it all started in March, right when the president was inaugurated. One of the first things he did was issue an executive order on religious freedom and conscience. This was a dramatic ceremony at the White House Rose Garden, and I had the pleasure and privilege of being there. The Little Sisters of the Poor were in the audience, and the president called the Little Sisters up because that was emblematic of what had been the problem that the Trump administration was trying to fix. Now, for people who don't know, the Little Sisters of the Poor are dedicated to serving the elderly poor. Their job is literally to be there in the last dying days of the elderly poor so they don't die alone. You can't think of a better mission than that. However, the previous administration imposed a contraceptive mandate requiring them to have insurance coverage and facilitate that coverage for their fellow nuns for contraceptives. And of course, nuns, generally not all that big consumers of contraceptives, but the previous administration thought that it was appropriate to force them on pain of millions of dollars in fines to provide contraceptive coverage to fellow nuns. So the president invited the Little Sisters up to the stage and said, we're going to get off your back. The federal government is finally going to respect the religious freedom of your organization and any other organization that just wants to partner with the federal government or simply wants to be left alone. That's what really this is about. They want to be left alone to be able to serve the elderly poor according to their religious beliefs. So it started with an executive order on that day. The president said, we're going to empower the Attorney General to issue guidance for all the agencies on how to respect religious freedom. We're going to vigorously enforce our protections in law that have been ignored, in some cases for decades, and we're going to get off the Little Sisters' back. We followed that up with a lot of action at HHS. So I'm the director of the Office for Civil Rights, and one of the first things I did was take an inventory of all of our religious freedom laws to make sure that there was no stone left unturned, because what I discovered was that this was the deprioritized civil right. Of all our civil rights, religious freedom was not getting the proper attention it deserved. So we did the inventory and stood up a Conscience and Religious Freedom Division to enforce all of the laws on the books that Congress has passed through its representatives, and it included regulatory action to make sure the Little Sisters of the Poor would never be forced to have to violate their beliefs versus following the law. We provided that relief, and we were upheld by the Supreme Court very recently in the Little Sisters of the Poor case. So from beginning till now, we've been firm, and it's all due to the president's leadership on this issue.
That's amazing. Can you also talk about what has this administration done for life issues? It's been called the most pro-life administration. Would you characterize it that way, and why?
Yeah, President Trump has been absolutely fearless on life. He's a champion for the unborn. The way he speaks about life, it comes from the heart. And he's followed up with policies. So one of the first things he did was to restore the Mexico City policy, to make sure that we're not using our federal funds to fund abortions and abortion advocacy overseas. That's a common sense thing. We can't do it within the federal government. We can't use taxpayer dollars to fund abortions. Why would we be doing that to try to spread it across the world? At HHS, we actually amended our strategic plan to make sure that we say we, of course, protect the health and well-being of all Americans, but we added from conception until natural death to make sure that nobody is excluded. Nobody is excluded from the protections that we provide. When it comes to funding of abortion, we enforce the Weldon Amendment to make sure that no money goes to any organization or any state that discriminates against entities that don't want to pay for, cover, or assist in abortions. And we've had, unfortunately, issues with the state of California that did not respect the Weldon Amendment. We had an issue where they were having a universal abortion insurance mandate. And again, this is a similar question as to the Little Sisters of the Poor. They were requiring an order of nuns to actually fund abortion coverage for fellow nuns. We issued a notice of violation to California. We're hopeful that we'll have compliance, but all we're doing is making sure the law is being enforced as written. And one more point on the life question. On Title X funds for family planning, we have been given hundreds of millions of dollars to organizations that perform abortions. Again, federal tax dollars should not be going to subsidize abortions. Whatever people think about Roe v. Wade and the legality of abortion, the American people have spoken resoundingly to say that you do not fund it using taxpayer dollars, because too many people object to it. Pay it on your own if you want. Do not force other people to pay for it. So we issued a rule saying you must have physical and financial separation from abortion operations and Title X family planning operations. We will no longer fund the overhead of abortion clinics.
Right.
After this rule was passed, Planned Parenthood and other organizations deselected themselves. They said they did not want to abide by those rules. They didn't want to separate financial and physical operations, and they have now voluntarily chosen not to receive those family planning funds, and we've been able to redirect those to federally qualified health centers that provide comprehensive services for women's health, so that nobody loses any of the services that they were receiving before, while we stand up for the dignity of human life from conception until natural death.
Yes, HHS has done so much to protect life. Now, with the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division, in addition to the California mandate, what other enforcement actions and other actions has the Conscience and Religious Freedom Division taken since then?
Well, on the question of can pro-life pregnancy resource centers retain their identity and their message, right? They exist to provide women alternatives to abortion out of compassion, to give them a true choice. Once again, the state of California took issue with the pro-life cause and targeted pregnancy resource centers that were providing these services for free for disfavor, saying that they must put disclaimers all around their messaging to essentially crowd out their own message. And on top of that, requiring them to advertise on behalf of the state of California that the state provided free or low-cost abortion services. So while they're on the one hand trying to present women with options other than abortion, the state was requiring them to say, but here's where you could get it for free, which is, of course, absolutely contrary to their message. This was a question that went up to the Supreme Court in the NIFLA versus Becerra decision, where the Supreme Court said this was questionable under the First Amendment. They have a free speech right to have their message. And if you read what Justice Kennedy said, that this is part of the authoritarian impulse that states have to try to force people who disagree with their approved message, try to force them to change their message against their conscience. Not only is it a violation of the Constitution, it's a violation of federal law that my office enforces. So we also issued a notice of violation there against the state of California. We followed it up with a notice we worked through with the state of Hawaii. They had a similar targeted discriminatory statute against pregnancy resource centers in the state of Hawaii. Again, trying to change their message against their will to a pro-abortion one. Hawaii was very willing to work with us to certify that they would not enforce their laws against pregnancy resource centers across the board. So we were very happy by that resolution. But we've been extraordinarily active on many fronts. Again, we established a whole Conscience Religious Freedom Division, staffed by incredible career professionals, to make sure that all of our laws are fully enforced, just like every other civil right. Conscience, religious freedom, of course, being our preeminent right. It's in the First Amendment. We have a free exercise clause that protects religious freedom. Based on the president's leadership, we're institutionalizing these protections. So it doesn't matter who sits in my chair as a director of the office, just like it doesn't matter for every other civil right. These are the laws that we have to enforce. It's not only the law, it's also the right thing to do. I'll give you an example during the COVID crisis. We've had issues with visitation policies where people have been denied the ability to see loved ones, to see caregivers, to see support persons with disabilities, and also clergy in their dying moments. As we try to save as many lives as possible, we shouldn't forget what we live for.
Right.
We live for religious expression, family, all those important things, so that we could balance safety to make sure the virus doesn't spread with compassion, to make sure there are people there who need it in those very trying moments. It's also good health care, right? If you treat the whole person as an integrated human being, body, mind, and soul, you have better health outcomes. So we had a very sad case of a couple who were in a horrific motorcycle accident, hit by a drunk driver, and had to be medevaced to University of Maryland Medical Center Hospital. They were denied access, the husband, to clergy. And this was a very dicey situation. He had multiple fractures and was knocked out, was intubated. It was a very scary time, was denied access. We were able to work with the hospital using CMS guidelines that reached an accommodation and resolved their complaint, where now the entire University of Maryland medical system allows compassionate care visitation for clergy, who of course have to put on PPE to go there, but again, in those horrendous moments of incredible stress, they're not deprived the right to have that integrated treatment, mind, body, and soul. So we're very happy to have that. And it only happened because we had a Conscience and Religious Freedom Division that was willing to step into that breach.
That's an incredible story, and I know that we've also reached an early case resolution with a New York hospital concerning a religious freedom case. Would you like to talk about that as well?
This was a case of a person who had beard requirements according to their faith, and this is common in Sikhism, in Islam, Orthodox Judaism, beards, and even Native American religions. They see it as part of God's creation and various rationales, but they do not cut their facial hair beyond certain lengths, etc. Again, we had a Supreme Court case recently on this. Even prisoners have a right to have beards if they have secular exceptions for those policies as well. So in this particular case, it was a question of mask fit, where a medical student was going to enter on rotation in a New York hospital, and they're taking extra precautions to make sure masks fit properly, again, for very legitimate safety reasons. Because of his beard, the hospital had questions as to whether or not it'd be a proper seal, and said, you actually have to shave your beard. And the student did not want to shave his beard because of his religious beliefs, and you could see the tension that would cause. Having to choose his religious beliefs versus the practice of medicine, which many people enter because of their religious beliefs to try to help and heal others.
Right.
Nobody should be put in that position if it could ever be avoided. In that case, we also helped mediate, I think, a win-win solution. We knew that there were alternatives, and in this case, a powered air purifying respirator, which is full face, which is actually better protection than the regular N95 masks. And they were able to find a powered air purifying respirator for the student, so he was able to do his rounds and be safe, patients be safe, and not violate his religious beliefs. So we're very happy with that result as well.
That's great, and of course, just like every other civil right, there should be made accommodations for people, and religious freedom is no exception to that.
Yeah, and this ties in with treating the entire person, mind, body, and soul, right? People do not give up their religious identity the minute they walk into a hospital, the minute they go into the workplace, the minute they receive federal funds. There's a tremendous amount of confusion over the Establishment Clause and what is the separation of church and state, etc. That ends up actually turning into discrimination against people of faith, institutions of faith. And sometimes because of ignorance, sometimes it's worse. There's sometimes outright hostility against people of faith, and we've seen this in many contexts. We have this in the adoption arena, where there's a movement by states to try to drive out religious organizations from the public sphere because they keep their identity as their view of family and how they help in placements, when there's plenty of room for people for all walks of life to be parents. And the federal government funds many organizations, but there's been a movement to exclude religious organizations because of their views on family, their views of marriage, and when they are sometimes the absolute best at providing the hard-to-place children, usually children with disabilities or older children, in loving homes. And the way they do it, they pitch a religious message to potential parents. They speak from the heart, from their religious perspective, to reach out to people, to reach out to the least among us. And those who use a Christian message, they say this is part of preaching the gospel, and they encourage people to become parents who would never otherwise become parents. And to say that because you use a religious approach, you are excluded from it would, I think, be a tragedy. So we stepped in again to provide relief under our religious freedom laws to make sure that we have even-handed treatment, so that anybody who wants to be a parent can become a foster parent, but organizations that come of it from a secular perspective or a religious perspective are not excluded because of it. We want to make sure that they're able to place children, as many children as possible, in loving homes. That is our overriding concern, and we take all comers. We want everybody who could help especially during the opioid crisis, find loving homes and forever families, to be part of the solution.
And actually in South Carolina, Miracle Hill placed 15% of the children in that state. So the place for religious freedom institutions, religious and faith-based institutions is a great one. Could you speak a little bit more about our conscience protections as they relate to the violation at the University of Vermont Medical Center and what happened in that situation where a woman's faith was not taken into account?
Sure. This is another sad story. You have a nurse who entered into the practice of medicine to help heal people. She told her bosses at her hospital that according to her beliefs and faith, she could not assist in abortions. She had in the past assisted with the after effects of miscarriages. That was perfectly fine. Unfortunately, one time she was called in, walked into the operating room, and was told by the doctor, "Don't hate me." Why would a doctor say such an odd thing when a nurse comes in for her shift? Well, it was because the doctor knew this was actually an abortion. It was not for the after effects of a miscarriage. The nurse knew what was going on and raised her objections again. "I can't do this. This is, you know, taking of a life." And she had told them she couldn't. And they said, "No, you can't. You have to do this. This is a patient. You could be accused of patient abandonment. You have to do this." And this was an incredible dilemma she faced. The ability to practice medicine was on the line. She could potentially lose her license, potentially lose her job. And what makes it even doubly sad is they had another nurse that was available that they could have swapped out in their roles, but they chose not to. And this was a fully formed child that she had to assist in an abortion, and she's been haunted ever since.
And hopefully no one else will have to go through that trauma. Our conscience laws protect from such cases ever happening again.
Yeah. And again, we have bipartisan support for the view that you cannot force people to participate in abortions. People could get abortions in many places in this country. So why are you going to force people to do it against their will? Why are you going to force people to pay it against their will? Why are you going to put a nurse in that horrendous position where she has to choose between her job and her convictions about the sanctity of human life and protecting human life? She was required to assist in the taking of human life. Nobody should be forced to put in that. And not only is that immoral, it's illegal. And we issued a notice of violation to the University of Vermont Medical Center for violating the law. And the law says you cannot receive federal funds on one hand and discriminate against people who stand up for life as a condition of their job. You can't do that. The American people have spoken very loudly and clearly, and it's high time that we enforce these laws.
Well, thank you for your work on that. I want to pivot to OCR's work during COVID-19, especially OCR's work on the disability rights front. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, and this goes back to the question of human dignity. When things get difficult, when there's a crisis, either the best of humanity comes out or the worst of humanity. And we want to be on the right side, on the side of the best of humanity. We had the question of resource allocation during the height of the crises, and we're not out of it fully yet. But the question came up, would there be enough ventilators for everybody? And what would happen if we had a shortage of ventilators? We have what are called crisis standards of care plans that have been planning for these sorts of eventualities. Sometimes they'd been on the books for many years, and they started to dust them off and say, okay, this is what we're going to apply if worse comes to worse. Now, the president took unprecedented action, used the Defense Production Act, for example, to make sure we had enough ventilators, to require companies and heavy industry to manufacture them. So we have not had the occasion of running out of ventilators, but we have to be prepared. We examined some of these plans and received several complaints from disability rights organizations because they targeted people with disabilities for either deprioritization or flat exclusion or strict age cutoffs as well. So think about what that meant. We had one state in particular that said people with quote unquote profound mental retardation would be ineligible to receive a ventilator in case of a shortage. So you would have a medical professional triaging and saying, you're fit, you're not fit. You live, you potentially die, based on whether or not they have a mental disability, right? That screams to me as a quality of life value judgment where somebody would say, because you are less useful, you are less human. And that goes contrary to our national character. And it goes contrary to our civil rights laws. So we sprung into action in an unprecedented way, to say, look, we bring this to the attention of the states. We want to fix this as soon as possible to avoid any situation where this could come into effect. And to the credit of now 5 states that we've worked with, they have been modifying their crisis standards of care to make sure there's no exclusion based on disability, no deprioritization, no saying that, well, your life is less valuable.
Right.
They want to have an individualized assessment and say, where medicine says you have a low chance of survival, okay, we take those things into account if we had to do some very difficult triaging. But we're not going to use stereotypes about, well, one life may have a better outcome in terms of their quality of life versus another, because that would end up being a de facto segregation of people with disabilities without, and saying you're more worthy than others. Older Americans, the same thing, saying you're too old to deserve treatment based on a flat cutoff.
Right.
Well, look at people in retirement age, very healthy, very active, blunt flat cutoffs would be saying that your life is you're done. It's right. Something that we want to allocate resources to somebody else, and we want to avoid those sorts of blunt cutoffs.
Yes, and of course, disability rights are human rights. Could you talk a little bit about also the work of OCR in the case of Joan Parsons in Connecticut and what her situation entailed?
Yeah, it came to the question of visitation policies. This was a woman who suffered from aphasia and short-term memory loss, and for years had been working with her daughter to communicate. And her daughter knew her signals, knew her nonverbal cues, knew her verbal cues, how to interpret when she was in pain, when she was hungry, when she needed something. She had many physical and health ailments, and also got COVID-19.
Wow.
Was being sent to the hospital under fairly emergency circumstances, and the daughter was not allowed to accompany her. So imagine the daughter trying to write down all the cues, all the signals that she had spent years developing with her mom to say, if she needs this, this is how she'll signal. If she's in pain, this is how you know she's in pain. To scribble it off, to give it to the doctors before she's wheeled off into the hospital. We got involved in that case through a complaint, through the disability rights community, and we were able to reach a resolution with the state, so that all state hospitals would have reasonable modifications, they're like accommodations, for policies on visitors, so that people who need those designated support personnel would have it. Imagine a person with autism who could only speak with one person, right? That's about being able to get them a fair shot at equal care. And in Joan Parsons' case, she would wake up in the middle of the night with people sticking her with needles, and she had no idea what was going on and could not communicate. And she'd lost that autonomy. She couldn't be in charge of her own care because she did not have access. And to the credit of the state of Connecticut, they changed their policies statewide to make sure that designated support personnel would be allowed in, taking all the proper safety precautions. Because again, it's health versus health. We want to treat the person as an integrated whole, mind, body, and soul.
Yeah, and in her case, she was traumatized by that because she didn't know who these people were. She didn't know how to communicate her needs. And it just shows the importance of having the support personnel there with her to make sure that she gets equal access to care just like everyone else. And this is where OCR steps in and defends the rights of people with disabilities.
Yeah. Everybody's equal from conception till natural death, regardless of their ability. There's, unfortunately in our culture, a strong utilitarian ethic that values people based on what they could produce. We're a very consumer society, right? What can you produce? How useful are you? And if you get a little older, if you have a disability, well, when push comes to shove, and you may be seen as a burden. There's a push towards assisted suicide against persons with disabilities because they're seen as less useful, right? It's the full spectrum. We had a question of resource allocation with transplants. This was a case in the University of North Carolina where a person wanted to get a heart transplant. It was medically indicated, yet in the doctor's note it said this person was not a good candidate because he was on the autism spectrum. Even though autism had nothing to do with whether the heart would take, right? So you see that subtle, and in this case not so subtle, quality of life judgments when it comes to allocation. And we want to say when it comes to life-saving care, we cannot use stereotypes. We can't use that utilitarian ethic. We respect fundamental equality, fundamental human dignity, because we are all created equal, and that principle is reflected in our laws, and they need to be enforced.
That's right. So what can people do if they feel that their rights or someone else's rights have been violated?
Well, we have an entire office for civil rights. We also do HIPAA regulation and complaints. Medical privacy is incredibly important to medical care, and conscience and religious freedom at the Office for Civil Rights. We have a website and a complaint portal, hhs.gov/OCR, hhs.gov/OCR, where you can file your complaints. If you don't file complaints, then we can't help as easily. We need to know where the problems are so we can address them along the full spectrum of every civil right: race, color, national origin, sex discrimination. We've been working very hard in universities to make sure that what happened with the gymnasts in the University of Michigan State would never happen again. So we got involved in the Michigan State case there. So we're a full spectrum office, but we've added conscience and religious freedom to make sure that our portfolio is comprehensive, and that's where we also are looking to see to make sure and get the word out that we're here to serve. Come bring us our complaints. We have regulations that we have put in place as well to make sure no statute is left behind, and we're in business.
Yes, and of course these are Catholic leaders that are attending this conference, and would you have any piece of advice, one piece of advice on how to really live out their faith as leaders in the church and in their communities?
This is a trying time for people of faith, Catholics in particular. Have courage and hope, and step forward. Step forward. There are many ways, you have many gifts as how you can help the common good, but don't be afraid to face criticism because you do it. And again, the courage of one gives courage to a multitude of others. And this is a trying time, so even though you may not see the fruits of what you do, we're not called to be successful in worldly terms. We're called to be faithful. And people say, well, what are you going to be when it comes to being on the right side of history? Well, I'm not sure what that means, but I'm not worried so much about being on the right side of history, but being on the right side of God, because that's ultimately who I'm going to answer to for everything I've done in my public life. And have I helped the least among us? Have I stood firm for human life? And have I followed the law, which is also part of my calling in my particular role?
Roger, you have done so much at OCR so far. What do you hope that is your lasting legacy?
That I left no civil rights behind, and particularly conscience and religious freedom and the sanctity of human life. Right? These are the principles that are under assault right now, and we don't know what the future holds, but we've had a tremendous run so far. We hope to keep it up because this president has been absolutely dedicated to conscience and religious freedom, more than any other president. And that's a bold statement, but a true one. He has empowered the administration and the federal government to finally take religious freedom and human life seriously, to use every lever that we have available under our law and our programs to make sure that we protect human life and religious freedom. And we've delivered, and we hope to deliver more in the coming years. So the legacy will be, I believe, in my case, our conscience and religious freedom division. And again, it doesn't matter, it should not matter who is leading my office. This should be part and parcel of how we consider civil rights. Religious freedom is part of it and should never be left behind, and I think that will be the legacy.
Thank you, Roger, for taking the time to share about what this administration, HHS, and what OCR is doing to fight for life and religious freedom and to protect human dignity. And thank you all for joining us.